This video was brought to you by Brilliant, and the first 200 people to sign up using the link below will get 20% off an annual premium subscription. On Monday, China's National Development and Reform Commission bragged that the country's GDP numbers for the third quarter of this year were quite outstanding, insisting that the Chinese economy had rebounded from the low of this year's second quarter, which saw GDP actually contract by 26% quarter on quarter. However, just a day after these remarks were made, China's official statistics authority quietly announced that it would be delaying the publication of this quarter's figures, sparking speculation that the Chinese economy was faring even worse than expected. So in this video, we're going to be taking a look at China's struggling economy, some of the proximate causes for it, and why many analysts think that China is unlikely to ever return to its pre-pandemic growth rate of roughly 8% a year. So let's start with the headline story. On Tuesday, China refused to publish its GDP figures for the third quarter. Now, no one was expecting particularly brilliant numbers here. Economists polled by Bloomberg had forecast a year-on-year GDP growth of 3.3%, which is well below the 5.5% target set by the CCP. And most of that growth rate is just recovering from the contraction of the last quarter as well. While it translates to a quarter-on-quarter growth rate of 3%, it only really represents a growth rate of 0.4% over the last 6 months. Nonetheless, while the publication has probably partly been delayed to avoid distracting from China's ongoing party congress, it does still suggest that China's GDP numbers are worse than expected. And if China's GDP numbers aren't brilliant, that most likely means that the real economy is faring even worse. That's because China probably overstates its GDP figures. And this isn't some kind of xenophobic conspiracy either. According to US diplomatic cables released by WikiLeaks back in 2007, China's current premier told American diplomats that China's GDP figures were, quote, for reference only, and described regional GDP data as man-made. Accordingly, researchers have compared China's stated GDP figures with various proxies for economic activity and found large discrepancies between the two. For example, take a look at this study comparing GDP figures to the brightness of countries' lights at night, as measured by satellites from 2002 to 2012. This might sound arbitrary, but the brightness of countries' lights at night is actually a pretty good proxy for GDP. The study found that in so-called free countries, where GDP data is often subject to some sort of oversight and therefore much harder to falsify, the brightness of a country's lights at night almost perfectly tracks with their GDP figures. The study then compared this to partly free and not free countries, and found that, in general, the less free a country is, the more likely it is to exaggerate its GDP data, with China being one of the worst offenders. According to the brightness of their lights at night, China's actual GDP growth for the 20 or so years measured is something more like 175%. China's official GDP figures, on the other hand, claim that the Chinese economy has grown by 375%. Now, we should say here that this study is particularly unflattering, and other studies using other proxies for economic activity, like shipping rates, have found less discrepancy with the official figures. Nonetheless, you get the idea. China's official figures apparently inflate China's real GDP. So if the official figures are so bad that they have to be delayed, the situation in China's real economy is probably even worse. So why is China's economy in so much trouble? Well, as we see it, there are broadly 3 reasons: the ongoing property crisis, the CCP's zero-COVID policy, and increasing geopolitical tensions. Let's start with the property crisis. Now, first thing to say here is that we've actually done a few videos on this topic before, so go and watch those if you want to know about this in more detail. But the TLDR is that in an attempt to deflate China's debt-fueled property bubble, about 2 years ago, the CCP introduced the so-called 3 red lines, which essentially limited how much money property developers could actually borrow. Now, while this might have been well-intentioned, it sparked a wave of defaults in China's property sector. including large, well-known developers like Evergrande. And while it's no longer in the headlines, China's property crisis has continued to get worse in recent months. And just over the last couple of days, borrowing costs for Chinese developers have hit a new high. This is bad news, because without cheap credit, more property developers are going to start struggling, which means that we can only expect the crisis to get even worse in the coming months. So that's the property crisis. On to zero COVID. Again, we've gone through this in other videos, but the TLDR is that with the advent of the more transmissible Omicron variant, the CCP's zero COVID strategy is wreaking havoc on the Chinese economy. Constant lockdowns across the country suppress economic activity and undermine both business and consumer confidence. But the CCP are unable to U-turn on this policy for essentially political reasons. That's not to say that zero COVID is necessarily a bad policy. China's per capita COVID deaths are well below their peers. And China does have a significantly lower vaccination rate among its elderly, which has to be accounted for. But the CCP have spent the last 2 years criticizing the West for its apparent recklessness during the pandemic. And it's now become one of Xi Jinping's hallmark policies. So it's politically difficult to reverse it, despite the economic consequences. The final issue impacting China's economy, though, is geopolitics. In case you haven't noticed, the geopolitical rivalry between China and America, and more generally between the West and the emerging authoritarian axis, is really heating up. And these geopolitical tensions have economic consequences. China is more aggressively regulating its strategic industries, including things like crypto. And America, in turn, is imposing increasingly severe restrictions on Sino-American trade, especially when it comes to technology. In fact, we just released a video on America's new semiconductor sanctions over on the TLDR US channel. It's linked down below, so you can check it out if you're interested. All in all, this creates risk for investment, which is why foreign investors are all offloading Chinese debt and equities at a record rate. Similarly, Western countries are increasingly wary of Chinese investment, and even smaller non-aligned countries are thinking twice about taking on unsustainable amounts of Chinese debt. Now, this is partly because China has proven to be pretty resistant to loan restructuring or forgiveness, even in times of distress. And as such, politicians are increasingly anxious about China's so-called debt trap diplomacy, which is when China allegedly uses financial leverage to extract strategic concessions from countries. This is apparently what happened to Sri Lanka in 2007. China loaned Sri Lanka a whole load of money to build a new port, a deep water port capable of hosting military ships. And when they couldn't pay it back, China wrote off the loans in exchange for a 99-year lease on the port. Now, we say allegedly because meta-analyses conducted by the Rhodium Group and Center for Global Development across all of China's loan restructurings have found that debt trap diplomacy is at least very rare, and that in the vast majority of cases, loans are either written off or deferred. Nonetheless, whatever the truth of the matter is, there's at least a perception among some politicians that China does engage in debt trap diplomacy, and that's made them warier of Chinese investment. You get the idea then. As geopolitical tensions escalate, foreign investors are pulling their money out of China, and foreign countries are becoming less willing to deal with China. So those are the three proximate causes of China's current economic troubles, and none of them look likely to subside anytime soon, which is partly why many analysts have been revising down their growth forecasts for China. BlackRock, for example, now expects Chinese growth to average something more like 3% for the next decade, less than half of the 7.7% average that Beijing achieved from 2010 until 2022. Now, 3% growth is still well above most other Western countries. After all, the OECD predict that growth in every G7 country is set to fall below 2% by 2024. But even still, this slightly higher growth rate probably isn't enough to allow China to compete with the US for world superpower status, which is sort of what matters most to the CCP. Ultimately, as China's currently discovering, we live in an increasingly complex world where things are feeling less stable, especially economically. So it would be great if politicians were better at, well, decision making and finance. And they could do exactly that by signing up for Brilliant, the STEM learning platform where you can learn everything from quantum computing or algebra to logical decision making, a skill many are severely lacking at the moment. Now, Brilliant's logical thinking course might start simple, but it builds, teaching you logical reasoning skills until you're solving problems which previously looked impossible. And you'll get used to that empowering feeling of learning, because this isn't just about memorization techniques. Brilliant teaches you by doing, using active learning techniques to teach you the principles behind otherwise complex subjects, and ensuring that you actually understand what's going on. Now, using this teaching methodology, you can learn about all kinds of STEM topics. That's algebra, applied probability, calculus, gravitational physics, or even cryptocurrency. In fact, Brilliant even have a new course from Kurzgesagt, which I found very personally exciting and I spent a lot of time playing with. Anyway, if you want to learn more in a fun way, then you should sign up to Brilliant. And if you use the link in the description, you'll get 20% off an annual premium subscription, which is not only a great deal, but also supports the channel. So thank you.